Welcome to the 2018 Virtual Summer School Series webinar sponsored by NAEPSDP and the Program and Staff Development Committee of the Southern Region Program Leadership Network and hosted by the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. I'm Julie Robinson with the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension Service. In today's webinar, we've got Dr. Quentin Tyler joining us. Dr. Tyler is the Associate Dean and Director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources at Michigan State University. Dr. Tyler holds 3 degrees from the University of Kentucky. He received a Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Economics, a Master's of Science in Agricultural Economics, and holds a doctorate in Sociology with an emphasis on social inequalities. He has spent over 13 years in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, serving previously in the role of Assistant Dean and Director for Diversity at the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture. He has received a professional certificate in diversity and inclusion from Cornell's School of Industrial and Labor Relations and has conducted diversity training and workshops across the country. Dr. Tyler has served on numerous university committees related to student success and is a life member of the University of Kentucky Alumni Association Board of Directors and the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture and School of Human Environmental Sciences Alumni Board Association. Dr. Tyler has been featured on UK at the Half to discuss opportunities and challenges in diversity and inclusion and has led national calls to agricultural educators on diversity. And he has also written national blogs on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today, Dr. Tyler is going to share with us how to assess your ability to navigate across cultural differences and commonalities, learn and grow through the IDI. So Dr. Tyler, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Hello, Julie. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to the session today. We're going to share about growing and assessing one's ability according to the IDI. So I wanted to make sure that we started off with establishing some core concepts. So as I saw through the multiple choice, a variety of you all selected diversity as a mix that makes a difference in terms of how we interact. And then also a lot of you all selected inclusion as how we make that mix work, and then also culture. So I think it's important to understand that, establish some core concepts, establish a common language, as we will use that throughout the presentation. So I'm definitely excited about, the ability to talk about learning and growing through the intercultural development inventory. I first came across the IDI about 5 years ago, and this was during the International Faculty Development Seminar. As we are aware in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're always looking for tools to help and aid us in the process of our journey. So as me being the individual that I am, being 13 years in this, I heard about the International Faculty Development Seminar. And I was really impressed with the IDI as it provided me a snapshot of where I am or currently am in terms of my intercultural competence. But not only did the IDI provide that for me, it provided room, a professional development plan for me to grow. One of the things about the IDI that I also respected and liked was the fact that there are over 2,000 qualified administrators that can facilitate the IDI, and it's provided and given in over 40 countries. It's been tested for validity, it's been tested for reliability, and also psychometrically too. So the IDI is definitely a tool that's been utilized in dissertations, chapters of books. It's been used in strategic plans and all across the board. So today we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you and provide an overview of the introduction of the IDI. I'm going to talk about ways I've utilized the IDI and also specific groups that I've worked with. We're going to do an interpretation of the IDI, which is very important. And then also I'm going to provide examples from 4 selected workshop participants that use the IDI. So we had a treat for 4 that were able to do individual assessments on the IDI. So also we want to highlight that the importance of intercultural competency. I think as we think about intercultural competency, a lot of times we look at it from a bias or a general stereotyping perspective. But when we think about it as a core competency and the importance of it, it provides cultural specific and cultural general frameworks for us to navigate across differences. So as you can see, and one of the things that I always share with faculty, staff, and particularly students, that that intercultural is a core competency that's needed in terms of our future in our workforce currently. So as you think about the IDI is a assessment of 50 questions, both qualitative and quantitative, that takes around 20 to 30 minutes to take. And it assesses one's ability to shift across cultural perspectives and adapt behaviors across commonalities and differences. And now you ask, what ways can you utilize the IDI? The IDI can be used in terms of our individual development. So again, it assesses one's ability to engage across differences, but also it speaks to any particular barriers that may impede your process in terms of adapting toward behaviors and commonalities and differences. And then also from a team and group perspective too. So if you have a team or group that needs to be it takes the ability for one to engage in terms of the IDI, but also what it does in terms of a group, it helps design training. And then also from an organizational development standpoint, the IDI, much like educational or organizational climate survey, it provides a snapshot of where the organization currently is, but also it has the ability to design policies, procedures, and structures that look at maximum effort and intercultural development. And then also what the IDI does is from a program evaluation standpoint. So if you have an intervention, and maybe whether it's be a service abroad, education abroad opportunity, or a specific training, you can provide a pre and a post test of the IDI. And then also from the standpoint of onboarding, recruitment, hiring, and talent selection, the IDI can be utilized in that aspect as well. So how have I used the IDI? So I've used the IDI in terms of some awareness training. It identifies maybe some blind spots that we have within specific organizations. It's been utilized in terms of our strategic plan, ensuring that every person or individual, team or group has went through an IDI. And then also it's been used in terms of our personal, unit, or departmental relationships. So if you have any type of topics or conversations that need to come up in terms of a group or organization or department, it's been used in terms of that. And then also I've used it in terms of a pre and a post education abroad experience and service learning experiences. So for example, if I've taken students to the Dominican Republic as part of the education abroad course, and those students were required to do a pre and a post test in terms of the IDI. And then also in terms of partnerships with organizations, I've utilized in that aspect. Now, specific groups that's worked with the IDI. So I've had over the past 5 years been a part of the National Manners, Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Science Advisory Board Chair. And one of the things I wanted to do is show where we are as an organization and how can we work together to improve, as an organization. So the advisory board has recently took the IDI. And in addition to that, every year as part of the National Manners Organization, we have an executive officer team and also a large officer team. And each of our officer teams have taken the IDI, in addition to having individual development plans developed for each student and professional. In the future, I've been consulted, I'm going to consult, and has been talked about with the Agriculture Futures of America organization. So they've taken the IDI and they're going to do a post-test after a series of training they've had. And then also we've utilized it in terms of our National Diversity Summit. I've utilized it with workshop participants in that. Our University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment ambassadors. So as part of their retreat, the ambassador organization has utilized the IDI. In addition to that, I've worked with faculty and staff in our College of Ag and Human Environmental Sciences as a part of our faculty retreat. And then also specifically within departments in the College of Ag, Food and Environment, Biosystems, and Agriculture Engineering department. So as you can see, it's been a variety of groups I've worked with in terms of the IDI. And each of those groups have received personal individual development plans in which we talked about ways they can improve themselves in terms of cultural competency. So as you talk about the IDI, one of the things I really like about it, it describes a set of orientations. And these set of orientations talk about how one individual shifts perspectives and adapts behaviors across cultural differences and commonalities. So initially it starts from a monocultural mindset of looking at denial and polarization to a transitional mindset of minimization to an intercultural mindset of acceptance and adaptation. And the thing about the IDI is not only is it descriptive and it tells you where you sit on this continuum, but also it's prescriptive in providing a developmental plan for you as an individual and also as an organization. So as you can see, we're going to talk about each of these orientations and talk about, some of the ways that you can improve in those orientations, but also what an organization looks like that has present in a lot of these orientations. So the first orientation that we want to discuss is denial. So the denial orientation involves a mindset in which an individual has limited experience or capability interacting with commonalities and differences. And in a denial mindset, an individual is disinterested in other cultures. Also, an individual typically avoids other cultures. When you look at a denial mindset, they tend to operate with broad stereotypes and generalizations about cultural differences and commonalities. And typically, when you think about it in terms of a denial mindset, an individual, if they're studying abroad, they were most likely like to experience food only from their home culture. And then also an individual from the denial mindset would say that they don't have a culture. And again, they don't value diverse views, and they're disinterested in other cultures. So when you have denial is present in the workplace, cultural diversity is oftentimes ignored. So when you think about the orientations, not only does it tell you where you're at, as I previously mentioned, it talks about ways to move forward. So when you think about denial moving forward, you want to engage an individual in denial in a non-threatening manner. So for example, it could be simple things such as clothing, food, music, art, and dance. And this typical simplistic interaction with individuals. And you want to ask the individuals to talk about things they have in common as talking about differences. 3.05% of people that have taken the IDI have denial as their primary orientation. And I want to remind everybody that when they think about, where one sets on the continuum, the IDI measures things that you can't see. As we talked about culture previously, always remember that culture is more than checking a box, but also understand that there's no such thing as a view from nowhere. So when you think about, culture, intercultural competency, these are things that people may not even be aware of too, as well. So again, around 3.05% of folks that have taken the IDI have denial as their primary orientation. So the next area that we're going to talk about is polarization. So polarization is more of the judgmental aspect of the IDI. So we say this pretty much judges differences. It's more from a us versus them perspective. When you think about polarization, it comes in two different forms. So you have a defense, and then also you have a reversal. So in terms of the defense, people that have defense as their primary orientation typically think about cultural differences as being divisive and threatening to one's own way of doing things. And then also in terms of polarization and defense, they think my way is superior to another way. And they're very critical toward other cultures. And again, they definitely think my way is better. So when you think about somebody that comes from the polarization perspective, they may think of things such as, a Spanish woman, a woman from Spain. She can't understand why anybody else that's not from her country would not want to attend a bullfight. Or for example, or if a student that studies abroad, the host person with the host country, the country abroad, cannot understand why the students can't speak Spanish to the host families. So they think their way is the absolute way. And they think of it from a judgmental standpoint. The other aspect that shows up in terms of polarization is reversal. So in terms of a reversal, they view the other culture's perspective as superior to their own. And this typically happens as in two ways. From those from an oppressed group that has little knowledge of what causes the mean from that, and then also from a dominant perspective too. And again, they see others as superior. Now, when you think about polarization, an example would be an individual, a boss that is responsible for employee resource groups. He's very supportive of the employee resource groups. And anybody that doesn't get it, he just simply has nothing to do with them. But he doesn't understand, when he thinks about the oppressed group in which he's supporting, he doesn't understand their cause. So he only looks at it from a standpoint that I'm supporting this group, and I think this group may be superior in some aspect to my own. And again, when we think about polarization, acceptance doesn't necessarily mean agreement. And we think about going back to denial. When you have denial present in a workplace, diversity, cultural diversity is ignored. When you have polarization in a workplace, diverse groups, cultural diversity is typically feeling uncomfortable too. Because you're going from the standpoint of defense, and then also you have it from the standpoint of reversal. It's 15.55% of the folks that have a polarization as their primary orientation. So just kind of doing a recap. So remember that denial means they miss differences totally. And then polarization means that you judge differences. And then minimization means you de-emphasize the differences. And we'll talk more in detail about minimization. So when you think about those within the primary orientation of minimization, again, they don't like to make distinctions. These are your folks that, de-emphasizes differences, period. And it can come from two ways. Maybe a lack of self-cultural awareness or understanding, but then also is utilized as a way to navigate from those that from oppressed or marginalized groups. So in thinking about that, they truly believe in a meritocracy. If they were playing Little League and minimization, everybody would get a trophy. And they lack cultural awareness, and they emphasize commonality, and they mask differences. And they have the idea of treating people equally. When you think about a minimization in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, they know it's important, but also they want to make sure that everybody is treated equally. So in terms of being colorblindness, they go along to get along, and they highlight commonalities due to limited cultural understanding, which is more common in experiences by dominant group members. And when you think about minimization of those who fall within this group, they don't want people to see that they are different. And they don't want people to talk about being different. And it can be a survivable, again, technique from those that come from non-dominant perspectives. But we talked about those from historically oppressed or marginalized groups and communities. So some specific examples may be, focusing on, recently there was a movement that talked about all lives matter versus whether it's Black or blue lives. Another example may be, instead of highlighting specific cancers, they want to say, let's celebrate all cancer, or let's do fundraisers for all cancer. And another example may be, instead of having maybe a women in agriculture group or minorities in agriculture group, let's just have a student organization or a professional organization that focus on all of agriculture. So the strategy for future development in this area would be just kind of raising the group's awareness around power and privilege, as well as other patterns of cultural differences. So getting that group to understand and recognize the differences that are present within, whether it be, your peers, your coworkers, students, etc. The correct answer is 65.2% of the folks that have minimization as their primary orientation. So just kind of recapping, we talked about denial, meaning dismissing differences totally, polarization, judging differences, and then you have minimization, which is transitional stage, and de-emphasizing differences. And now we have where we're moving toward the intercultural mindset of acceptance. And acceptance is the orientation that deeply comprehends or understands intercultural perspective. They have the ability to shift perspectives. But the only thing about acceptance is that it's known as they can talk the talk, but not necessarily walk the walk. So when you think about it from an acceptance standpoint, they understand they can ask the right questions. When you have a group of individuals that may have differences that are viewed as cultural, they can ask the right questions, but they may not fully be able to have the recommendations or suggest ways to move forward as an organization, as a group, or as an individual. As you see right here, it might have some specific cultural challenges that may, conflict with personal, moral, or ethnic, beliefs. And that's one of the interesting things about that from an acceptance perspective. When I first took the IDI, I was around the acceptance area. And I had the ability, I understood the importance of cultural difference. I had the ability to shift perspective. But at times, my behavior, I didn't know how to adapt appropriate behavior across differences. So when you think about that in terms of the acceptance, it is moving toward past the transitional stage of minimization into an intercultural global mindset. So again, when you think about someone from an acceptance perspective, they have 2 to 3 more cultural experiences. They have a variety of experiences in which they're able to learn, they're able to talk. They have a curiosity. They think about their own cultural perspective and how it adapts, to certain behaviors or experiences across cultures too. So when you think about the development strategy for these folks, it's continued interactions across cultures in a way to expand their knowledge, and also, the ability to adapt cultural general and cultural specific frameworks to gain skills to adapt in differences. And again, it's to confront ethical questions within workplace or a living situation. So when you have acceptance in an organization, diversity feels understood. People know it's valuable, but may not truly feel how to engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So actually the correct answer is 14.65% have acceptance as their primary orientation. The last orientation that we'll talk about is adaptation. And again, as we kind of go back over the other orientations. So again, denial is just kind of totally dissing differences. Polarization is more along the lines of judging differences. Minimization is de-emphasizing those differences. Acceptance is deeply comprehending or understanding. And adaptation means that having the ability to bridge across the culturally shift behaviors, but also to truly be able to not only have perspective, but able to bring people in groups together too. So adaptation is the last stage on the intercultural development continuum. It's also the last stage in terms of an intercultural mindset. So again, when we talk about adaptation, this individual is looked at as a leader within the organization. Not only can they shift perspective, but they understand and know how to adapt to appropriate behavior. These are individuals that, you go to in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They can lead trainings, they can bring people together. They can have those facilitating conversations too. But the only negative about a person from an adaptation perspective is that at times they could be so far along the continuum, they forget to bring people with them, and they can totally turn off folks that are from the monocultural perspective. So one of the things, if you're in adaptation, you have to be able to recognize that people are at different places in terms of the continuum too. And then when you have adaptation in the workplace, diversity feels valued and definitely involved too. So not only are they focusing on the pipeline issues of diversity, they're looking at access, and they're looking at having an environment that's in terms of collaboration where everybody feels valued and people don't have to sacrifice any parts of their identity, perspective, or background. So actually it's 1.55% of the people have adaptation as their primary orientation. So the last thing I'll talk about before we go into an actual example is cultural disengagement. So this talks about one's connectedness to a cultural community, whether or not, they feel a part of a group. And this is not an orientation, but this just kind of tells, whether or not you as an individual or as a group feel a part of a community too, as well. And from the examples, when we talk about to show some examples, we'll show a cultural disengagement as well. So before we talk about specific examples that we've had from some of our workshop participants, it's important to understand that, one of the things that I like about the IDI is that it tells you where you're at. A lot of times from my experiences within my presentations, a lot of individuals like to argue and say, hey, this is not me. But my response is that the tool tells you where you're at on the continuum. So this is not Quentin Tyler telling you and assessing your cultural competency and your ability to navigate across differences. This is you. So as we look at this right here, as I previously mentioned, that it provides a group overview. So we're going to look at first what the group perceived versus developmental is. So as you can see up top this is what we call a perceived orientation. This was how you view yourself. And a lot of times we tend to think of ourselves a lot better than what we actually are. So as you can see, as the group of 4 individuals that took the IDI from your workshop, the perceived orientation is a little bit greater. It's a little bit more than 115 in terms of, it looks like a little bit less than 130, but 124.47. So that falls within the acceptance range. And as you can see, we as a group, those that took the IDI, believe that we deeply comprehend and understand diverse cultural competency and diversity, cultural diversity. You know, we feel like we understand how to shift perspectives and adapt cultural appropriate behavior across commonalities and differences. But in actuality, as you can see, the bottom figure is what we call our developmental orientation. Our developmental orientation is what we actually are. And our developmental orientation is a little bit in terms of a little bit past minimization at 103.22. So as you can see, again, we as a group believe we're at acceptance, but we're actually in minimization. And if you think about and remember what we talked about in terms of minimization, those that fall within minimization tend to de-emphasize differences. This is the everybody gets a trophy. In terms of meritocracy, you know, they believe we don't want to talk about differences. You know, this group may have a limited self-cultural understanding. And then also this group, you know, this may look at as a way to navigate a strategy in order to navigate differences toward to understand the values and perspectives of the dominant group. So again, as you look at this right here, our perceived orientation is 124.47, which is an acceptance, but our developmental orientation is at 103.22, which is below acceptance, but above minimization. Now, again, as part of this workshop, we have 3 individuals, we have 4, but actually I'm going to show you 3 individuals that took the IDI. So as you can see, individual 1, their perceived orientation is 119.76, which is under the acceptance. As you can see, as you can recall, the acceptance is somewhat similar to what we had as a group. And they believe they deeply comprehend and understand cultural, the ability to shift perspectives and adopt behaviors according to commonalities and differences. But in actuality, this group is on the cusp of minimization, but actually in polarization. And if you recall polarization, it's a us versus them mentality. So the individuals that score within this area tend to judge differences. It's either in defense or it's either in reversal too, as well. So again, as you can see, you know, individual 1 thought of themselves a lot better, well, better than, you know, themselves in terms of the developmental orientation, which was on the cusp of minimization. Now let's look at individual 2, perceived versus developmental. As you can see, in their perceived orientation is an adaptation. So that means this person believes that they have the ability to bridge folks. Not only do they deeply understand, not only are they in an intercultural mindset, but they have the ability to bring people together. These are your leaders in the work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. This individual believes that. But if you look at their developmental orientation, this individual actually scored in adaptation. So their perceived orientation and developmental orientation actually in some ways matched. So this individual is an individual that you look at, you know, in terms of facilitating training. This person, you know, can shift perspective and adapt behaviors and commonalities and differences too. Now, individual 3. So individual 3 believes that they are in the acceptance at 116.47, which is their perceived orientation. But in actuality, the developmental orientation is a little bit past minimization at 93.28. And if you think about it, if you recall, over 65% of the folks that have taken the IDI have minimization as their primary orientation. So just kind of something that this individual 3, and I think one of the previous individuals matched with what the percentages are in terms of those that have primary orientations or minimization. Now, what helps in terms of the perceived and developmental orientations, what we call the orientation gap. So it compares what you view as yourself in terms of the perceived and also what you actually are. So on average, 7 points or greater is meaningful in terms of your gap, your orientation gap. And on average, pretty much what you think you are and what you actually are is 20 points. So as you can see, we have, as a group, 124.47 as the perceived orientation, but the group developmental orientation is 103.22, which is somewhat in line with the 20 points, but it's meaningful in being greater than the 7 points, which is statistically significant. And then also, if you look at participant 1, if you look at participant 1, the orientation gap, the perceived orientation is 119.76, and the developmental orientation is 83.97. And then as participant 2, as you can see, the perceived and developmentals are in line, and it's less than 7. So what they thought they are and what they actually are in the line with each other. And then in participant 3, the orientation gap is 116.47. And the perceived orientation is that, and the developmental orientation is 93.28. So pretty much on line with the 20 points on average on what they perceive they are and what they actually are. What also the IDI tells you is the typical orientation or behavior that you may act in terms of certain topics, times, and situations. So as we are aware, under certain topics, times, and situations, we may resort to typical, to other behaviors. So if you have a score of less than 4, it says that you have a trailing orientation. So as you look at the group, we have a reversal orientation, which is at certain topics, times, and situations. So it may be under stressful events. So as I can recall in dealing with certain individuals or conversations, when things get kind of, maybe toxic, we say, hey, let's talk about what we have in common instead of talking about our differences. Or your cultural group is superior to my cultural group. And that's what it says in terms of reversal trailing orientation. So under topics, times, and situations, then we resort back to that particular behavior. If you look at participant 1, they also have a reversal trailing orientation. So again, under certain topics, times, and situations, they resort back to a reversal. So that could be, again, in looking at, your cultural group is superior to mine. And then also in terms of, hey, let's just kind of just de-emphasize our differences. So let's kind of just, everybody's equal. Let's not talk about differences. If you look at participant 2, again, they have a minimization trailing orientation. And they also talks about, in secondary one in terms of being similar. So again, that kind of more talks about, de-emphasizing differences. Not necessarily from a reversal trailing orientation, but more from a defense trailing orientation. So again, that person may talk about, my group being superior to yours. It's the us versus them mentality. Or, hey, when you talk about differences, it's divisive. It's threatening to my own cultural group. And then as you can see, participant 3 is right at 4. So they do not have a trailing orientation. So one of the things that I do love about the IDI is that it does provide a snapshot of your organization or your group, and also an individual, a snapshot. But it also provides you an individual development plan or ways that you can improve. So again, as you talk about it being prescriptive, as you can see, there are what we call leading orientations. So the leading orientations are ways that we can move forward. So as you can see, as a group, as we talk about de-emphasizing those differences, we have an acceptance, we have the ability to move toward acceptance and adaptation. If you look at participant 1, participant 1 at 83.97 is on the cusp of minimization, but in actuality, they're in polarization, but they have the ability to move toward minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. And then in terms of participant 2, they're in an acceptance area, but they're on just a little bit into adaptation, but they have the ability to continue to grow in the area of adaptation. And then in participant 3, as you can see, they're in minimization on the cusp, in that terms of polarization, minimization, but have the ability to continue to grow within minimization, but also in terms of acceptance and adaptation. As we talked about the last group, which is cultural disengagement. So as you can recall, I talked about any individual or group that tests below 4 means that you don't have a connection to a particular group. You have more of a disconnection. And as you can see from my group, is that we scored 4.33, which means that we do feel like we're a part of a cultural group. And then as you can see in participant 1 has 4.80, which feels like they're a part of a group. And then participant 2 does feel like they're a part of a cultural group as well. But if you look at participant 3, they have a score of 3.40, which in turn do not feel like they're a part of a cultural group. And if you look at their individual development plan, it has recommendations in terms of things that they can do, or just some additional questions they can ask to further, understand why they do not feel a part of the group. As we talked about previously in terms of the IDI, it has quantitative and qualitative questions that provides context. So one would be able to understand, why participant 3 doesn't feel like they're a part of a group. If I can talk about a specific example where I was doing this with a student group, there was an African-American male that tested below 4, and I asked them, during our individual debrief, you scored below 4. Why do you not feel like a part of a group? And he said, well, to be honest with you, I grew up in certain households, certain situations, and I didn't know, my father. So I didn't have a sense of a positive self-identity. And then also, that's why I didn't feel like I was a part of that group. So those are all situations. And then the great thing about the IDI is that the qualitative piece, the questions that we ask, provide context to the quantitative questions, and we should be able to, answer some of the questions that people may have individually. So again, as we talk about, individuals spending 20 to 30 minutes in the IDI and providing this assessment, that each individual gets an individual debrief, which we talk for about an hour about how they scored and how the qualitative questions provide context to some of the questions that we asked. And again, as we think about, the IDI, and I'll say this over and over again, I really like utilizing it because it provides a snapshot. But also, when you're thinking about becoming a qualified administrator, or if you want to have people come in and facilitate the IDI, you have to understand that a lot of times people do not like being told the truth. And I feel like the IDI does an excellent example of providing a snapshot because it's the tool that, again, is assessing one's ability to shift perspective and adapt to culturally appropriate behavior too. So again, from my experiences in facilitating the IDI, a lot of times people may not like or feel good about where they are, but I also like to say that the IDI has a detailed individual development plan based on your orientation that provides room for growth. As we know, it's a journey, in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. And I always say, progress, not necessarily perfection. So again, I want to thank you all for joining the call in terms of learning about the IDI and utilizing the IDI from my experiences.
We would just like to thank Dr. Tyler for joining us today, and thank you to our participants for joining us as well.